shortly after Rishi Sunak spoke, Nationwide said it would be increasing some of its tracker and fixed rate mortgages by up to 0.25% from tomorrow, increasing fears that the country is still in for a very rocky period. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to someone who knows more than most about the UK economy, Andy Haldane. He worked at the Bank of England for more than 30 years and was its chief economist. He's now chief executive of the Royal Society of Arts. I caught up with him a little earlier. Thank you so much for being on the programme. What would you say is the priority, or should be the priority, for the economy?
I think it's growth. I think we've gone now getting on for 2 years without growth. The economy's been stood still for 2 years, and that's put huge pressure, Sophie, on households, huge pressure on public services, huge pressure on local governments. And the only way to break free of the constraints on them is by us growing our economy sustainably in a way that hasn't happened for the past 24 months.
I'm keen to talk about the sort of solutions, if you like, but just to look at the context of it. So do you think that growth is going to stay low, or potentially for the rest of the year?
I think the next year, if you believe the mainstream forecasters, they would tell you growth set to remain below 1% this year. We've still got that squeeze from higher interest rates. Although people's pay packets are now nudging up faster than prices are nudging up, nonetheless, people are still poorer than they were 2 or 3 years ago, and we won't recover the levels of their living standards until perhaps 2026, 2027. So that's a big headwind still.
Is there a risk of a recession?
Well, we'll find out later this week, actually, whether growth in the fourth quarter of last year turned negative. And if it did, that would technically count as 2 quarters of negative growth and hence a recession. But underneath that, really, the picture is still of a flatlining, a pancaking in the economy that most likely, I think, will persist over the next 12 months at least.
Do you think the bank are being a bit slow to cut rates?
They were slow on the way up, and we know that now. And that's one of the factors that contributed to inflation getting away from us. The good news now is inflation is coming down at a fair old click, from 10 now down to 4. I think by the spring, we could be looking at inflation rates back to around target, Sophie, around 2%. And I think the risk as inflation comes down at a fair old click is that the bank might be a bit slow in cutting in the same way it's a bit slow in raising. That's where I would put the balance of risks right now.
If you still had a vote, would you be cutting rates already?
I'd be cutting rates now, and probably would have been from the tail end of last year. I think at that point we knew that inflation, although still a bit too high, was coming down, and the essence of monetary policy is to look ahead, not to where inflation is, but to where inflation will be. We now have a good degree of confidence that by, as I say, Easter time, inflation will be within spitting distance of target. We see pay inflation now coming down, also at a fair old clip. So it strikes me the balance of risks now is skewed towards growth rather than inflation. We need to support and stimulate growth that remains, as I say, largely absent as things stand.
You talk about how difficult things have been for people being poorer now than a few years ago. And of course, there is a pay dispute here at the Royal Society of Arts as well. Do you have sympathy with the campaign for a pay rise?
Well, there's no question that across the whole country, there's been a big squeeze on pay packets. The biggest squeeze probably since the 1950s on pay packets. That's been true right across the piece. It's also the case, though, that the biggest cause of that squeeze on pay was the high level of inflation. And that's why the bank had to put rates up to squeeze inflation back down to target. Ultimately, this is about what is affordable for individual organisations and for the country as a whole. And of course, I've got a huge amount of sympathy for all the households and all the people whose pay packets have been squeezed. But ultimately, this is about affordability.
Not everyone agrees. You have had a few people boycotting the organisation, Chris Packen, Yanis Varoufakis, example. What would you say to them?
Well, ultimately, what you need to do as a leader is to ensure that the organisation is run on a financially sustainable basis. No one benefits from running unsustainable finances, whether it's this organisation or any other, and recklessness, ultimately with pay, that causes financial stability problems is not good for anyone's jobs or anyone's pay packets, and that's why we've had to work in a very prudent fashion, really important.
You talked there about being responsible, leading an organisation and financially as well. How would you grade the government, the way that they've been managing the economy?
Well, I mean, it's with growth low, that makes it very tricky to manage the balance sheet of the government as it is the balance sheet of a charity or any business. There's no question about that. The way the government manages its balance sheet right now is through a set of fiscal rules, included among which are a rule about debt and getting debt down on a 5-year horizon. Now, that sounds sensible, given that levels of debt for the government are now very high. Nonetheless, I think the risk those rules pose is that we don't make enough investment today to support growth tomorrow. And that's why, personally, I would favour fiscal rules that cut the government some more slack to enable it to invest today for growth tomorrow.
You're talking a lot about investment. It feels to me like if there is any slack, the government will be minded to use it for tax cuts, particularly in the budget and maybe as soon as the budget. What's your take on tax cuts? Would that be stimulus for the economy?
Well, it would be stimulus. The question is it the right type of stimulus? Tax cuts tend to support, depends a bit where they fall, but if it's tax cuts for households, they tend to support spending by households rather than investment. And what the UK needs right now is investment. So if it were me spending my pound, it would be not on tax cuts, but rather on investment of various types, whether investment in technology or innovation, or investment in people, in their training. We are falling short on both fronts. That's one of the main reasons why growth here in the UK is so anemic, a lack of investment in both kit and in people.
Investment, Labour has just pulled a whole load of investment, haven't they? The 28 billion a year that they were preparing to spend on green investment. They say that because of the fiscal picture that they would have inherited, if they do win the election, then they just can't get to that number. Do you think that that was the right decision to scale that back?
I think it's a shame. I mean, I think back to when that Green Prosperity Plan was first hatched. It was big, it was bold, it was ambitious. It led the world, actually, in terms of its scale. And we now have seen a number of other countries playing catch-up, putting forward their own plans. So I think the scaling back of our plans in the UK, at the same time as other countries have stepped up their plans, is unfortunate for two reasons. One, it slows our transition to net zero, which is really important. And two, we do need that investment. And the Green Prosperity Plan was about that extra dose of investment to stimulate growth. So I rather lament the sort of paring back of those plans.
Do you think Labour should be a bit braver than you think when it comes to spending, to invest?
Well, I think whoever it is in charge right now, I'd like to see a little bit more boldness about the economy. I mean, thinking boldness around investment, I think is what we need to get the economy going. I understand the fiscal constraints, but I also think the rules that we've sort of boxed ourselves in on might not be as effective as they need to be to stimulate and support that investment.
You were talking about green spending there. We were just chatting earlier, weren't we, about the North East, and you were saying that how it's one of the areas where you're quite excited potentially about the future because one of the industries that is a growth there is the green.
It is. I mean, there are lots of areas, I mean, well-kept secret, but lots of business sectors across the UK are doing well, and green tech in its many and various forms is one of them. I mean, it's funny, Sophie, I think there's a huge amount of energy. I mean, it's not here in Westminster and Whitehall, but it is out and about across the UK regions and nations right now. You know, they're going to be newly emboldened with powers, we hope, And they are crafting and hatching very ambitious plans. Let's take the Northeast. That could be a green tech super hub in future. And that would be great for jobs, be great for giving the area a new narrative about their economy. And I see there real potential, as I do elsewhere across the UK actually, to be the sort of bottom-up approach to national growth. And that gives me real optimism, probably optimism beyond this year, but nonetheless optimism that growth is there at the local level.
Which is actually almost the counter-narrative to one that you often hear, that levelling up has failed, that we need to do much more to support the regions. But you find positivity, I guess, optimism there.
I do. I think it's there. Newly emboldened leaders are drawing up plans, ambitious plans, to take their regions to the next level. Of course, that will need some money, some of it from government, but a larger part of it from the private sector. And the good news there is the world is actually awash with cash. We just need to find a way of getting more of that private cash into parts of the UK other than London and the South East, and that could really light the fuse on growth in the UK's regions.
We started talking about what you think the priority for the economy should be, which was growth. I think we should perhaps end by talking about your kind of policy priority. If you were, PM for a day, you can push something through, get both houses to back it. What would you go for?
Yeah, so I think it's actually about, if I had one thing, it would be the distribution of powers. In two ways, I would be much more bolder, less incremental in the powers I give to local leaders to become masters of their own destiny, because that, I think, is where the energy is in the country right now, and that's where the potential is greatest to unlock people, unlock communities, and to grow then the national economy. And the second thing I'd do, Sophie, is to split the Treasury in two and have it confine itself to managing the public finances and create a separate economic or growth ministry to take charge of the reins in driving that growth I mentioned was so important for solving those problems of diminished pay packets and struggling public services and struggling incomes. I think we need that singular focus, rather like the Bank of England's singular focus, which was given back in '97 as the first act. We need a singular focus now on growth, and that means a ministerial singular focus on growth, and that would mean something doing different at the Treasury than is the case currently.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy Haldane.
Thank you, Sophy.